Time to begin next panel, EU and transatlantic response to global risks. I think we will have a very nice follow-up to the discussion that was more localized, more regional about the EU and Ukrainian future. Now we are looking at the EU and the transatlantic response to global risks. And please welcome to the stage Joséphine Staron from think tank Synopia in Paris, who will chair this session and introduce all the panelists. Joséphine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for this conference and for giving me the opportunity to chair this panel on such an interesting topic. We have 4 speakers today. One is online, which is Yanir Baryam, who is president of the New England Complex Systems Institute. He will join us shortly. He's online. Okay, perfect. We have Mr. Bartkot, which is already on stage, program director of the Warsaw Security Forum.
Hello. I was quite fast getting to here on the stage.
Maciej Grodzicki, I'm so sorry for the pronunciation, from the Jagiellonian University, Polish Economics Network. Thank you for coming. And last but not least, Jan Filip Stalniko, member of the Program Council of the Citizens Congress, former director of the Innovation Department at the Ministry of Development and Technology. Welcome. So the theme of this panel, EU and transatlantic response to global risks, makes even more sense today after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, of course, but even more recently, after the brutal attacks of Israeli civilians by Hamas that led to a new war in Gaza. And that also led to a new polarization between the West and the rest of the world. Previously to all that, the world had faced the most global pandemics with the COVID-19 that brought the world to a standstill. These events and all their consequences, we can think of the energy crisis, inflation, the crisis of multilateral institutions, they have reshaped international relations and the balances of power. The West has repeatedly found itself isolated in its international positions, already with regard to sanctions towards Russia, and now to the condemnation of the barbaric acts of Hamas and support for Israel. And some observers even talk about a new Cold War. Alongside this, we're also facing major new challenges. Global warming, which is forcing sustainable transitions in our social and economic models, the technological race and rapid progress, particularly in the field of AI, the contestation of international organizations, notably the UN Security Council, crisis of democracies, of course, and increased and violent economic competition with China, of course, but also with our closest allies, like the United States. So faced with all these challenges, the good news is that Europeans have not remained inactive and naive, quite the contrary, in fact. In response to the pandemic, the EU reacted swiftly with a historic economic recovery plan, a joint loan, and one of the world's most ambitious vaccine purchasing and redistribution plan. In response to the invasion of Ukraine, the EU has implemented an unprecedented program of sanctions against Russia, and she's also coordinated the dispatch of arms and financial aid to the Ukrainian government. And discussions on European defense have been revived with the war in Ukraine. All these events have brought Europe out of the geopolitical obliviousness in which it had been trapped for decades. Words such as power, sovereignty, and autonomy, those words have suddenly reappeared in everyday language among European countries and institutions. In addition to the Green Deal, European governments have become aware of the need to reindustrialize Europe, to give us the means to produce in Europe so that we are no longer so dependent on other countries, and to gain greater autonomy and sovereignty. Regarding defense and security, European states have increased their budget spending, but we still have a long way to go until we build reliable defense industry and capacities. So the question today that I will ask is, isn't Europe's political awakening too late to face all the challenges and global risks ahead of us? And to help us understand the global situation and to find sustainable and long-term solutions, I will now leave the floor to our first four panelists, starting with Mr. Boryam. You're president of the New England Complex Systems Institute. Hello.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you. So in your
Very
research, you focus on many domains, such as the study of social networks, market crashes, social dynamics, violence, or pandemics. I'd like to ask you about the global risks we're facing today, like the current crisis in multilateralism, polarization of international relations, isolation of the West, resurgence of conflict in the world. How can this situation be explained in a scientific based?
Hi, thank you. Let me give some background about the issues of addressing problems, and then maybe I'll be able to answer some questions, okay?
Perfect.
So basically, I want to talk about the issue of solving problems rather than, first of all, the nature of the problems specifically. I think that there really is a very basic challenge that we have to think about the solutions. And the problems that we have include disease and poverty, economic development, hunger, climate change, and many others. But what I want to do is to say that if we wish, we actually know how to solve the problems. And what I'm seeing is that the difficulty that we face is that people are seeing the problems in terms of the questions of political power. And in the context of political power, there are two different possibilities. There is conflict or compromise, and that those are the ways to solve problems. But what I really want to say is that we actually know how to solve many of the problems. And the question is, are we going to work from a problem-solving perspective on addressing these problems? The problem-solving perspective really is saying that we can collaborate together to address these problems. I'm separating out the issue of warfare, because warfare is not just the need to solve a problem, but it's itself the use of conflict instead of cooperation. And that's quite obvious. And so the solution there is to recognize that where there are problems in society, where there are challenges, the conflict is not solving problems, that we can use a solution of problems to address whatever are the challenges, much better, of course, than warfare, which itself is creating problems and not solving them. But either way, recognizing that we can address problems that we have in society will create a new context of much better lives. And the key issue is really to recognize that working together is a choice that will matter. Now, this may be obvious, that if we work together and we solve problems, we will be able to improve our conditions. But the question then becomes, how can we work together? And in order to work together on solving problems, the main thing is to analyze directly the relationship of policy and consequences. If we understand clearly the consequences of the policies that we are choosing, we will then be able to address these problems. So this is true, of course, in many domains, right? If in personal life, in business situations, the solution to a problem is to identify what the problem is and to figure out what is the best steps to take to address the problem, and then to use that understanding in order to solve the problem. In order to do that, of course, to be successful, we have to be honest with ourselves and with others about what the consequences of particular actions are. We're going to have a set of actions that we might choose, to choose the ones that are going to be directed at obtaining the solutions to the problems that we have. In the context of policies, science can help to identify the consequences of policies. And I want to talk about this for a few moments because there is a confusion about two different issues that are important. The one that I want to talk about first is that we need to have some caution in understanding the role of scientific analysis and policy decisions. Because a lot of science is being done in order to accumulate knowledge. And that's very different from science for addressing policies. And the reason is that when we advance knowledge, we often start, in fact, generally start with hypotheses that are not validated. And we base research on those hypotheses. And these hypotheses during the period of the investigation, even though they're at the time speculative or exploratory in nature, the vast majority of published scientific articles and statements by scientists are based on assumptions that are not validated. And in the contrast, when we use science for policy, it's essential that we use validated assumptions. Of course, under those conditions and only under those conditions, does science give validated conclusions about the implications of policy actions. So those are that's the way to do science for informing policy decisions that affect millions of people, including their economic conditions, health, and lives. So we need to train scientists and policymakers to distinguish between science for knowledge accumulation and science for policy. So I have devoted 30 years of my life to using science to identify the solution to societal problems using carefully validated assumptions. I know that economic growth comes from regulating the balance of wages and investment, that hunger can be solved by proper regulation of commodity markets, that much of the violence around can be addressed by respecting social groups and boundaries between them, and that pandemics can be solved by acting preemptively, similar to fighting fires. Each of these conclusions requires understanding the specifics of how a social system is regulated by our ability to control key parameters that influence outcomes. And of course, I'm happy to go into details, but this would take more time than we have today. But the point is that there is a lot that we know already and more that we can know. But the solution ultimately isn't in the existence of this scientific knowledge. It is in the decision to work together to focus on solving problems. We need to create a group of people who are practical and pragmatic and devoted to the solutions. Some of the challenges can be addressed, at least in part, by a country by itself, not waiting for others. Other problems have to be addressed with collaboration across countries, and others have to be addressed really globally through collaboration across the world. I'm sorry, I'm just done. I want to just say that Europe Impatient, the coordinator of this meeting, is exactly a group that can help to build this collaboration. I strongly recommend to work with them to make this happen. Poland can be the envy of other nations with startling economic growth, elimination of poverty and hunger. My father was born in Poland, and I would like nothing better than working with you to advance solving these problems. It can serve as an example. It can pave the way for global action on climate change and warfare, and I hope you will take this path. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Bortkat. You are Program Director of the Warsaw Security Forum. You've been working in the defense and security field for many years now, especially on transatlantic relations. So today I would like to ask you about this relationship between the EU and the US and about the security of Europe. Is NATO a sufficient guarantee of security for Europeans today, with the prospect of former US President Donald Trump being re-elected next year? Isn't there a serious risk for security and defense cooperation?
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. Wonderful to be here and to discuss that topic, because I guess a lot of people are actually asking themselves this question, especially about Trump. But to start with, one thing that you already had said during your opening remarks, because you described the current status quo of the war in Ukraine, etc., as the new Cold War. Well, I tend to contest that view, because in my opinion we are in very much hot war right now, and we are fighting that war. And as you can see, the new front lines are opening, and I suppose that we will face a lot of them until any kind of the, let's say, Cold War way of dealing with conflicts will appear. Because the thing is that during the Cold War we had some lines of communication with the other side, and of also fighting with conflicts not only in the warlike scenarios. But getting back to the core of your question, so relationship between the European Union, Europe, I would say, and the US in the light of possible Trump presidency. I would say that, first of all, the relationship that we have between the US and EU is based on two factors. The first one being, I would say, the common values, and the second one being the common security perception. The war in Ukraine has clearly shown that we are very effective if actually those two things align, and if the perception from the European side and the perception from the American side align. Of course, it has also shown the effectiveness of NATO alliance in protecting the security of its allies. However, the fact is that the strength of NATO is not only it lies not only in the fact that we have, let's say, better prepared troops, that we have better equipped troops, etc., etc. It lies predominantly in the fact that we act in solidarity, and that we are actually ready to act together when the security threat potentially appears. No one actually have ever tested that. This is an assumption, but since the assumption is that strong that we believe in this solidarity between the allies, that has the deterrence effect towards the potential attacker, such as Russia, for example. But where actually that readiness comes from, in my opinion, there are like two factors. First of them is actually the preparedness of our armed forces, the fact that they are superior to the potential so-called red team from the other side. And second one being actually the political leadership. And the fact is that when the war in Ukraine has started, bless you, when the war in Ukraine has started, we saw the leadership being forged in Central Eastern Europe. We saw the leadership being forged in Washington. We saw a leadership being forged in London, but not necessarily in all of the capitals around Europe. And even today, despite the fact that we are sending a lot of military supplies, that all those who are lagging behind in the beginning are actually right now speeding up, and they are like maybe even in the forefront of those who are sending a lot of military equipment to Ukraine. we still observe the lack of proper military investment when it comes to the capabilities of the NATO allies themselves. And when we talk about the US, honestly speaking, for leadership in Washington, and it doesn't matter whether that's Biden or that will be Trump or whoever else, DeSantis, whatever. The global rivalry with China is actually the predominant factor that shapes their strategic vision of security. If Europe continues to depend on American support in protecting its own security, it will have to face the question coming directly from Washington. Are you prepared to protect yourself if we are occupied with China? Of course, the answer to that comes a lot from Paris and from Berlin, saying, yes, we shall establish our strategic autonomy, or open autonomy as it is called right now, and that will be a proper way of actually dealing with our own things when potentially the US will be occupied with China. The truth is, however, that in my opinion, we are absolutely unprepared for that. So the strategic autonomy in many of its shades, I would say, it's rather a concept either used for lobbying for European industry versus the American one, or it is sometimes used even by some political narratives as actually a way of spreading the image of Europe as a potentially balancing power between China and the US. So once we become strategically autonomous, we'll be at least to some point independent from the US in terms of protecting our own security, and then we can choose which path we should go, because we have already chosen to decouple from China or the risk from China, but not necessarily actually to the extent that probably some of our American allies, and especially Trump, would like us to do it. But at the same time, of course, I mean, from what I said, from the fact that the paradigm of transatlantic security changes a lot and will change a lot, that's certain. It is crucial that we establish our own capabilities when it comes to protecting our own security. But, and that is my very own personal view, but I guess I can find a lot of arguments for that. Securing Europe can be done through the most effective military alliance that has ever existed in this world, and that's NATO. And instead of actually, focusing a lot only on strategic autonomy as a concept that is spread around the European Union only, we should actually try to focus on NATO and our commitments to NATO, because as I established in the very beginning of this short speech, it has proven to be very effective. And it has proven to be effective despite some lack of political leadership coming from some of the capitals. And to end that vision of future, well, Trump's presidency, if it happens for the second time, it will cause a lot of strategic problems to European perception of security, because I don't believe that we are prepared for that at all. We only started actually thinking about it. Quite late in the process, to tell you the truth, having in mind how old Biden is. But what I'm afraid of is that if Trump becomes elected, a lot of political groups in Europe will only find that as a good excuse to go even more into this idea of Europe being a balancing power, and trying to misalign the interests of US and Europe. And the role for Central Eastern Europe, Poland maybe even especially as a potential leader of this part of Europe, is actually to prevent that misalignment. Why? Because we have quite a good relationship with the US, despite and it was proven even during the time where Trump was a president. So we should actually stick to do whatever it takes to prevent the misalignment of those interests with Washington, because actually whoever governs in the US, it is in our own interest to talk with them and to find a way to protect our own security, especially on the eastern flank of NATO. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maciej Grodzicki, you are Grodzicki, sorry. Is it correct?
Yeah, it's Maciej Grodzicki. Yeah.
Grodzicki. So you're a Doctor of Economics, research staff member at the Institute of Economics, Finance and Management at the Jagiellonian University, board member of the Polish Economics Network, and a union activist in the Employee Initiative. Your research focuses on international political economy, global supply chains, and the economics of common resources. So one of the risks we're facing is that of Europe's economic decline, as we're in an increasingly competitive world. How do you explain this situation, and why is our economic model no longer adapted to global challenges?
Thank you. So I will start with two premises. So first, well, when we speak of global risks, one may think that they are somehow external for us, that these things like climate change, migrations, imperial wars over depleting resources, they are coming somewhere from out of the system. I rather speak of the contradictions of the system which are emerging and which we, meaning our major institutions, major political, economic actors, we co-create. And second, I will focus on Europe, and I give, in my understanding of these dynamics, the primacy to economics or productive structures in particular. So thinking of Europe, we see that the current economic construction of the European Union is based on this regime of export-led growth. What does it mean? It means that the growth is the main aim of functioning of the community, and the major way to achieve this growth is supposed to be the export success or international competitiveness. So it's like an old mercantilist story, which is now embedded in European institutions. And it has profound consequences, which we see in many spheres of social economic life. So not only production, but also social provisioning, social reproduction, health, security, we are all subject to these prevalent logics. So we have, you can see, we have a single market, we have single person which sets the cost of credit throughout most parts of the Europe, but then we have separate labor forces, separate budgets, separate spheres of social assistance, separate sets of wage regulations, and so on. And in consequence, we observe the race to the bottom logic. So it's very hard to overcome this logic of competition and to coordinate actions in economic sphere, but also in other spheres of life, when whole nations are set to compete against each other in the single market. And then we have other contradictions, like profound inequalities, like wage distribution in Europe is 5-to-1. Average wage in Western Europe is even 5 times higher than in, say, Bulgaria or Latvia or Poland. We have 10% in-work poverty, we have precarious working condition, many social issues, and so on. And now, well, we see that despite many struggles in recent years, this regime is eroded, that also economically, even in these rough GDP measures, Europe is stagnant. It's very hard to, for instance, guarantee demand, where we focus on keeping the wages down. And then also this model is also offshored to our say partners or our suppliers organized in supply chains throughout the world. So we try to offshore the costs, offshore the emissions to other regions of the world. But it may function only to some point, only at a short range. Now, in order to overcome this contradiction, to say we need to focus on these underlying causes. So we need more coordination, not only in these market spheres, but also predominantly. This is I think established knowledge in many circles in Europe for years already. More coordination in the fiscal sphere, in wage policy, in labor standards, in social policy, health standards, and so on. And then, so only then we can, for instance, think of such processes as transition, which should be like a huge chance for many spheres of our life, not as a risk, right? Why is it a risk? Because it's subject to the logic of competition. And also thinking of our partners out of current European Union, so Ukraine, but also Balkan region, Maghreb countries, perhaps also other parts like Sub-Saharan Africa. Thinking about partnerships with these regions, they also should be organized in a way that allow these regions to reproduce socially. We need to think about how to strengthen local communities so that people from these different parts of the region would not be thinking of how to leave their countries, leave their communities, leave their families, and undertake these very dangerous ways to reach Europe, right? So thinking about European supply chains and supply chains built with our partners in other regions of the world, they also should be organized on a fair basis. So thinking, in my final sentence, I would like just to pick up on the notion which has been already somehow embedded in the European process, that we need to think beyond the primacy of economic growth, but also thinking about such different transitions which Europe is subject to at the moment. So the justice, in order to have just transitions, the justice should be introduced first, and only then we can think about how to introduce green transition, digital transition, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. Jan-Philippe Stalnico, you're a member of the Program Council of the Citizens Congress, former director of the Innovation Department at the Ministry of Development and Technology. So we're talking more and more about EU and transatlantic rivalry in technology and critical materials. With the American Reduction Act, Inflation Reduction Act, launched by President Joe Biden a few months ago, Europe fears unfair competition and seems to be unable to reply with a similar economic plan. How can we cope with the fierce competition, particularly from the United States, but also with China? And is Europe capable today of building its economy and its industry over the long term and making its mark in the global value chain?
Thank you for the invitation. I will start from the last question, probably it's the best starting point. Currently, Europe, and it really doesn't matter whether it's considered the old Europe versus the broader Europe, since 2004, is around 60 to 50% of American GDP. I don't know whether you know it, but we used to be around 80% of American GDP. Right now we are around 50. Yeah? So America is still constantly growing economy. So in terms of growth, leaving behind the perspective of degrowth and all this post-growth economics, we're lagging behind. The key question for Europe is China, of course, and the conceptual tool that Europe coins in order to grasp the problem of China was to define the China in 3 dimensions, in terms of rivalry, in terms of partnership, and in terms of being a kind of an enemy. So we can shift this 3-dimensional or 3-axis perspective to America. Yeah, so we are rivals, we are partners, and we are very rarely enemies. Yeah, so we see probably mostly the balance, shifted balance between rivalry and partnership. But we are a weaker partner. and much weaker partner. Yeah. So what actually is needed in the next decades, from many perspectives, is more sovereign Europe. That means this partnership will be stronger the more Europe will be sovereign. Yeah? And it doesn't mean autonomous. Sovereign, being sovereign, it's a very old notion, but it was coined like in the 16th, 17th century, but it's much older. Having autonomy of decision, this is the essence of being sovereign. I am sovereign as a person if I am not directed by the external influence. Yeah, that I have my own grounds and my own means to realize my goals. And the problem is that we might even have our own internal point of view and our own internal European grounds for some decisions, but we rarely have the means. For example, the warfare, classical warfare, we are dependent on American security. We must remember the birth time of NATO. Euro was completely demolished. It was completely devastated by its two own internal wars. So we needed an external actor who saved Europe twice in 20th century in order to not to let Europe into Stalin pockets. Yeah, that was the essence of NATO. And, well, we still have this problem, actually. So did we somehow, evolve into something more sovereign? The answer is no. So this is one axis that we should think of. But on the other hand, we have cyber war. Yeah? I work in the institute, which is one of the pillars of the cybersecurity system in Poland. And the answer is also no. Because most of the software and most of the companies that provide cybersecurity solutions in the world, in the Western world predominantly, are American companies, and some of them are Israel. Yeah? So we have our own deficiencies in this field also. Let's take the Ukraine example in the dimension that we rarely consider, it's like government security, government continuity. That's a parallel to the notion of business continuity. So who provided the continuity of the Ukrainian government? The answer is Microsoft, because they shifted everything into the cloud, and they were ready to serve the services like education or having documents. If they were physically demolished, they would be virtualized in the cloud. Yeah? So does Europe has its own cloud? No, it doesn't have. It failed, actually. That was a IPCI project on that, and it was 6 years later than it should have been. So my general, maybe quite philosophical thesis is that we need to think in Europe in terms of sovereignty of Europe, which is a complementary notion to the national sovereignty. Because the nations joining the European Union or forming the European Union were shifting parts of their sovereignty to Brussels. But they never called it a sovereign actor. Yeah, they were reluctant to do it. So every legal act, after every legal act, we shift parts of our national sovereignties to some central actor. The decision-making process is very complex. The actor even has the problems of the impersonation, because the Ursula von der Leyen is usually complaining about sitting on the wrong chair with the current head of the European Council. So we don't have this person. And of course, if we make analogy to America, we have the situation at which there would be no American Constitution, the Union. In Europe, it would be only Articles of Confederation. Yeah? So we have similar situation. And from the old European geopolitics, we have the situation in which all the European states are very similar to the Italian states in 16th century, that there were Spain and France invading Italia. Even the Italia was very rich. Yeah? They had all the money to, hire their armies, but they didn't have their own army, and they didn't have their own internal coordinating actor. And we have the countries on the, so to say, European peripheries. These are very different countries, like Greece, Portugal, even Poland, or whatever, Hungary, that are bribed by external powers, like China. Special partnerships with China, selling the separate ports to the China companies. So we don't have the actor which monitors the sovereignty of the entire club. Yeah. So the problem, the conceptual problem, is that we must have a unified notion and rebalance the perspectives for politicians between national sovereignty and European sovereignty in terms of it should be a zero-sum game in terms of the particular competences, but we must remember, and this is the problem of national democracy, that shifting the power to the European Union should have a sovereign remark or sovereign facet. From my professional experience, I have the problem that the European Commission doesn't think in terms of the Europe as a sovereign actor. The particular bureaucrats think in terms of some procedures or treaties or something like that, and most of these treaties, especially in terms of trade, are very open. Yeah? So if we ask, should we prevent China to buy particular technologies, the intuitive answer is yes, we should. But how can we do it? The answer is in the same vein that we do with the sanctions of Russian oligarchs. We just declared it and nothing else. Why? Because we have no means. Yeah? So the question for Europe right now is to define the sovereignty of entire club in terms of the complementary sovereignties on the national and the European level. These are complementary things. And the second thing, we should give the means to realize our own decisions. So we have some external shocks that allowed us to alter the problem. The vaccines, the broken value chains or supply chains were part of that. And warfare right now is, of course, one of another examples. But what we are lacking, and this is probably the essence of the problem, is the national perspective of the decisions, because most of the politicians who are able to shift this power and empower the central actor are nationalist politicians in terms they are elected by the national populations, by the nations. And our common interest in Europe is to inject in every country the sovereign perspective, because everyone will start to think about this complementary sovereign perspective. And from my private discussions, it's quite quick to get to this point, because most people think that intuitively that we are losing something in this sphere of tools and competences. How to do it, probably the other conference. But from my personal perspective, is the first practical mean, even though it comes from the theory, it's a kind of practical mean to establish what the first speaker said. How can we employ different sciences to give the European sovereignty its tools, to be effective? This is probably the next step.
Thank you very much. We have a little bit of time for one or two questions in the audience. In the back.
Thank you for that.
Just for our
Yeah.
American panelists.
Yeah, so I work for an American think tank called the Democracy Collaborative. But broadly speaking, fascinating contributions, but broadly speaking, the European Union's economic model is based on growth, and it's based on endless material and resource use. And that growth is then redistributed and for social outcomes. Given the climate catastrophe, the concentration of wealth, we need to make a huge transition. I don't believe the EU as it's presently formed and the economic model that embodies the European Union is capable of making that change. Do you?
I wanted to ask maybe a little bit, maybe to all the panelists, but especially to Yanir and to Jan, just a quick response about, in this dynamic, what sort of relationship the cooperation and competition maybe was once used the word. How should we coordinate? How should we delineate different issues, given the increasing complexity? And also to Yanir, what do you think should be the U.S. position, and how do you look from the other side of the pond at our struggles to coordinate, and maybe to other panelists, and especially Jan, a little bit of a response of how we should, especially in this delicate but strategically important, crucial relationship, how should we work together?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I spoke in very great generality. I think that the challenge that we are facing, and this is pervasive, is that there's a huge amount of detail in the information that we have. It's very hard to separate details that are important from details that are secondary to the important policy levers that we have in order to change the behavior of the system. And Krzysztof is talking about a very important one, the strategy of coopetition, of how localities, and this was mentioned by earlier speaker, are thinking about how they're interacting with other localities. But in order for us to be able to evaluate these issues, we really have to step back and understand what are the major levers. To see economic growth as being counter to the challenge of addressing climate change may not be actually the case. It is, we have to think again about what are the levers that will impact economic development. And I do think that for decades, we have misunderstood the primary levers that affect economic development. And this is impeding the ability to improve the economic conditions. Similarly, if we address each problem and look at the levers that we have to change it that are fundamental, and this includes climate change, where we believe we understand what are the key levers, and we are having trouble organizing political action to address those key levers. I think that, again, the challenge is not that we are, the challenge is to separate the details that are really important in some context, but are not the ones that policy has to change the behavior of the system. And if we focus on the levers that policy has to improve the conditions, then we can address the first order issues before we are concerned about many details of what is going on in the system. And I'm sorry that this is, again, at an abstract level, but in order to do this reframing of the perspective, we have to first do this piece of identifying those very important levers and use them, hopefully, to improve the behavior of the system. And that's the key point that I have to share.
Thank you. Maybe the other panelists, one last word and to answer the two questions. And I repeat, the first question, is EU capable to make the transitions that are needed for climate change?
In its current shape, probably no. But it doesn't mean that Europe is not changing. It is changing constantly, even though the treaties are not changing. And what I would argue for, that we should think, in a way, the Americans think about their constitution as living constitution. This, of course, is one of the two main interpretations of the constitution. The second one is originalism. So they balance these two perspectives with a shifting balance in their Supreme Court. But in general, the vision of the, it's kind of a joke right now, the vision of European flag, which comes from the Virgin Mary stars and from Bible apocalypse, is the ultimate vision, yes, how to build something which is confronted with the apocalypse. So even though it comes from the Christianity, it's still valid perspectives. Yeah? So having a kind of a union that the founding fathers envisioned is right now impossible, because we don't control internal fractions in Europe. Yeah? So we allow European societies to be weaker, and this is the main problem. It comes from ideology, from my private perspective. It's too much leftist thinking established in the universities, transmitted to the public policies, and so on and so on. So we don't think sovereign. Once again, this notion. Yeah? So how to think about sovereign societies. The sovereign societies manage themselves. Of course, they may be in conflict, but they manage themselves. And right now we see Paris, Berlin, and all these capitals of Europe, Western Europe, having like several 100,000 demonstrations supporting Palestine, and their government supporting Israel in general. Yeah? So there's an internal fraction which we probably won't solve. So this is one of the dimensions, the internal coherence of the European societies, cultural coherence. We don't have the adaptive model like Americans have. Why do Americans have this adaptive model? Because they have their constitutional patriotism. Yeah? So you might be Latino or Pole or Italian or whoever, but you become American by joining the flag. Yeah, you might serve in the army and be a citizen, and serve in the army and become an educated person following years. So we don't have this offer in Europe. We have close perspectives of societies that are getting older and older and think in terms of their own past greatness. What is lacking, we should admit that we are losing, but at the same time, it is kind of a win. Because if you admit that you're losing, that you have only a wall behind you, you start to think in terms of the solutions. So having this vibrant perspective, which right now UK have, that they have Indian Prime Minister. Yeah, this is something really intriguing. I don't know whether we would be able in Poland to have, I don't know, Ukrainian Prime Minister or someone like that. It's almost unimaginable. But if we think in terms of the common interest, and we have the framework, the conceptual framework to think of it, we can manage this. Every single regulation of European Union should have this dimension of thinking embedded in itself. And right now we have this problem technically in the regulation on the common European energy market. This is really important part of the European regulations, which would make Europe a unified energy system. Yeah? We have a vision of Green Deal, but we don't have the vision of the market tools that will allow us to transit to these perspectives. And once again, this is our common interest. Of course, we can join also the Ukrainian perspectives in this particular issue because Ukraine has overcapacity in their nuclear power plants, and we need this energy in general to transit, to have a green transition in Europe. So Ukraine may technically join the European energy market right now, and actually it was ready just before the war, and Russians destroyed this capacity. But this is the way of changing Europe without changing the treaties. Yeah. So you may think technically, but at the same time you should have a unifying notion. And the role of the politicians, this is probably the most difficult role, is to translate to the particular societies the sense of this transition, because the union always has its costs, and there are always losers of the union. The Americans had a civil war about it. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Koch.
I'll be very brief, actually. Well, Europe has changed a lot during the last 2 years, or maybe even more than 2 years since the beginning of COVID, in a way that was absolutely, we couldn't imagine that change to happen. So somehow it proves that we changed through the crises, that it was like always being said. But what I would actually argue is that since the change is needed, certainly, I would argue against actually only sticking to the bureaucratic, institutional-wise thinking about the future of Europe, because a lot of discussions that are happening right now are merely focused on reforms that touch only institutions, which is not necessarily maybe the most important factor and idea that we should be discussing. And I would also underline that somehow, actually, in this thinking about the future of Europe, we absolutely lost the importance of subsidiarity. And we are thinking right now about changing the European Union actually through the lens of a centralistic view, which at least from what I think about security, for example, not necessarily is always the case, because as I argue, NATO might be very well, even better positioned to establish the better security for Europe than, for example, European Union. So those are like two notions from my side. Think about not only institutions, and secondly, think also about subsidiarity in that regard.
Thank you, Mr. Godziski.
Well, lots been said, so I just will. What I learned from all these speeches here is that we certainly need much more collaboration, cooperation, and our current rules in the European Union, they rather promote competition and market transaction types relation. So perhaps think about sovereignty. We should rather think about our aims, what we really need, and not about our rules, which are more or less, well, they are just some words on the paper, right? Thank you.
Yeah, one last word.
I would add an additional technical example. The security of the renewable economy, renewable power sources offshore. Yeah. So, who is responsible for the security of pipelines from Norway to Europe? Yeah. Or who will be responsible for security of the 30% of European energy mix which will be on the seas? Yeah. Mostly in the offshore wind. This is a practical issue. So you, instead of discussing this abstract legal things, you should solve the particular problems. And after you solve several problems, you will get this idea. And this idea behind is ability to protect our common infrastructure. Because if we have European energy market, the pipelines in Algeria or the wind farms in Morocco or whatever are part of the European interest, because this all energy will flow through the Europe. Yeah? So everyone will understand that this is our own European interest to establish a tool of protection, which is, of course, sometimes a military tool. Yeah?
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the 4 panelists.